Today I'm going to show you how to make a baby booty sized classic knitted slipper. This is a design quite similar to something hand knitters have been using for generations, but it is not a translation of the hand knitted version. Instead, we're going to use some tuck stitches because that's what the machine does easily and without a fuss. And we'll get a result very similar. I have a Ravelry pattern for these that includes infants to extra large adults and 2 gauges so that either bulky or mid-gauge machines can make it. A version of the pattern that includes 1 gauge and 4 baby sizes will also be appearing in Country Knitting of Maine News and Views. Here I'm going to show you how to knit the smallest of those sizes using either a mid-gauge or bulky machine at a gauge of 5 stitches per inch with worsted weight yarn. This is a little bit smaller than the sweater gauge I normally aim for with worsted weight yarn because we want the slippers to have tight knitting. Cast on 29 stitches using E-wrap or any neat cast on that you like and knit 2 rows. I normally knit mine by knitting back from hold for the first 2 for safety. If you're going to employ a ribber for the ribbed portion of the pattern, you're going to need some weight. I'm using the one from my Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools book, and that's adequate weight that it will allow me to use the ribber. If you have not made yourself one of these, you should begin in waste yarn and hang the ribber comb and some weights in the waist because you're going to need it later. Set the carriage so it will hold stitches that are brought all the way forward and use a stitch size a bit smaller than you would use if you were knitting a sweater. With this yarn, I'd knit a sweater at stitch size 6 to 7, so I'm using 4 here. If I had chosen to work on a mid-gauge, I'd probably be using stitch size 6 to 8 with the goal of getting 5 stitches per inch. Row gauge is not critical, not because it doesn't matter, but because you can easily make a test slipper and tweak your row count to get the length of slipper that you desire. Now we're going to start alternating 2 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5th stitch from the edge goes into hold on both sides. Knit across. Place that back in the upper working position and count into the 11th stitch from hold. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Notice that the ones we returned to upper working position knitted normally. That's what we wanted to happen. These now go back. 5th come out. These now go back. 11ths come out. Oops, that's not right. That should be the one. Keep alternating these 2 rows for a total of 10 to 12 rows. I'm going to make mine 10. All of my tuck rows are done, and by now you can see the interesting changes in the columns of stitches that were tucked, and that is integral to the shaping of the slipper. Okay, those are our foot rows. Now we need to bind off 4 stitches at the beginning of each of the next 2 rows. Well, this is this side. Put those out of work and across. And I made a mistake. I should have set these to knit back from hold, but I can fix it by hand. Because we're done with the tucking. 2, 3, 4. And knit across. And now we are ready to set up for 1-by-1 ribbing. So I will take off the regular sinker plate. And put on the ribber arm. And set the ribber so that the stitch size will be balanced. I'm not changing the main bed stitch size. And on my ribber, on this particular machine, the stitches match. But you need to discover what matches on your machine. It varies from model to model and from specific machine to specific machine. Now, I already have enough weight on here because my heavy comb is adequate. If you did not have such a comb, you really should have started in waste yarn with the ribber comb in the waist. But if for some reason you didn't do that, you could now put the ribber comb on the existing knitting, but you're definitely going to need some sort of weight across for this step, which is to knit for 9 to 11 rows. So I'll split the difference and I'll do 10. 1, 2. Okay. You do not have to come back to the main bed for this step with these stitches if you would rather just pick them up and gather them off in their zigzag formation. However, I've compared it, and I think this is faster, even though we do have to transfer stitches, just because I find it easier to run the yarn tail through these stitches with the ribber and its extra gate pegs out of the way. Okay, that's all of them. Time to lower the ribber. Leave a generous yarn tail. Thread it into either a yarn needle or the double eye needle. And now run the needle through several stitches. Eventually it'll get difficult to work it in and out. So that's the point at which I begin to pull through and drop them. It's your choice whether to remove the weights for this step or not. It's kind of a personal call. I have them on right now, and it does make it easier because the weights stretch the stitches open. But if you're not careful at the very end, you'll drop the whole thing on the floor. So we're left with this vaguely T-shaped item. The cast on is back here, where my right pinky is. Here's the area where we knitted tuck stitches in that 2-row pattern, the bind off, and the ribbed area. And I left a good yarn tail in the ribbed area so we can finish with it. Pull it tight because this is the end of the toe. I actually sometimes go across the end of the toe. Oops, I missed that side. And knot it again. I know knots are supposed to be a no-no, but they're very useful to reinforce some things. And this area, which was the 2 edges of the work, will become the top of the foot. Seam it any tidy way that you like. Here you see me whip stitching every other row. I don't tend to favor the mattress stitch seam here because it doesn't lay quite as flat. And you can see this is coming out fine. One doesn't think of the whip stitch as invisible, and it really is not. but I find it works okay here. But as I said, if you have something you'd rather do, that's totally fine with me. The main thing is to get the results you're hoping for. And now we see the foot shape forming. My fingertips would be baby toes. You can see me either from the inside or the outside, but the purl side of the first part that we knitted is the outside of the slipper. I want to take my working yarn back to the back to complete the seam. And I see no harm in simply running it along this way, although there's also no harm in using a separate piece of yarn if you would rather. But now I'm back here and ready to work. The area that we're about to seam forms the back of the heel and ankle. And the area where we bound off forms a little cuff. I'll get this seamed together also. Here for this particular one, I'm whip stitching again, but I'm catching every piece of the cast on, every cast on stitch. Carried the seam down far enough that when you flatten what is the sole of the slipper between those two nearest to one another sets of tuck stitches, there's enough left of what was part of the back seam to flatten against it, and then we can shape the heel. I think in a lot of the old hand knitting patterns, they just seamed straight down, and you may do that if you want, because actually the person's foot will sort of press it into shape. But I've tried it both ways, and I think this is my preference. And of course, if this is an adult or a child that can walk, this area should be sturdy because it will be a stress area. For an infant, it doesn't matter, they don't walk. But ta-da! That's what makes the little shape of the shoe. Of course, it should be finished by weaving in ends. If you want to secure the cuff a little bit, that's perfectly okay. It's not truly necessary, but you might like it anyway. It's not necessary to catch every stitch, but there's less of a tendency to unroll if I do that. Here's the heel seamed in the manner that I just showed you.